Jack Newfield, the distinguished reporter and biographer of Robert Kennedy, has a story in the New York Post called Hoffa Had JFK Killed, and it goes on to say Hoffa had the mob murder JFK. Jack is on the phone with us now. Pick up this story for me, Jack, when you got interested in it and in terms of this particular exclusive.
I got interested in it in September when my friend Nick Pileggi, who had known Frank Regano for 20 years.
Frank Regano is the lawyer for
lawyer
Hoffa?
for Jimmy Hoffa and Santos Trafficante, the mafia boss of Florida, and a close associate and friend of Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss of New Orleans, as well as a lawyer for many other people like Rocky Marciano and Connie Francis.
And what is he saying now?
He is saying now that in January or February of 1963, he met with Jimmy Hoffa at the Teamster headquarters in Washington, and Hoffa asked him to go deliver a message to Marcello and Trafficante that he wanted President Kennedy murdered. And Regano says he viewed Hoffa as a hothead with a short attention span and didn't really believe it, but he did sit down with Trafficante and Marcello in the Royal Orleans Hotel a week later and said, Hoffa asked me to tell you guys he wants you to murder the president. And then he said they didn't say a word. They looked at each other, exchanged knowing glances, and moved on to another subject.
Is there any reason to know anything more than that from what he has said, what Regano has said? Regano.
Well, other than the day of the assassination, he had dinner with Trafficante, and Trafficante was euphoric and drank a toast to the assassination of the president and said, now we can go back into Cuba. Now Robert Kennedy can't prosecute us anymore. And I think one motive for this version of history is that Robert Kennedy, as the Attorney General, had both Hoffa and Marcello under indictment in the fall of 1963 and was actively investigating Trafficante. Trafficante and Marcello wanted big loans from the Teamster Pension Fund and believed if they acted on Hoffa's instructions or request, they can get greater control over the pension fund, which was like a $500 million unlicensed bank, to the mob. And Trafficante and Marcello were ruthless gangsters who had arranged for the murder of many people in their careers. And I believe they had the capacity to do this, and I think Hoffa had the desire to see this happen, and Regano is the one person in history who hasn't spoken up until now, and he had been Trafficante's lawyer for 27 years and Hoffa's lawyer for 15 years, and he was a witness to the most intimate conversations. And I checked him out with a lot of people, and he is credible enough that his information should be shared with the American public, and he says he is willing to testify before Congress now that he's 68 years old and has nothing to lose and nothing to fear. He wants the country to know what he knows because it's a burden to his conscience.
Before we go, just one more question about this linkage. All we know, though, in terms of other than relaying Hoffa's request, number one, this was Hoffa's lawyer, two, and that he'll testify under oath, and two, and be subject to perjury, two is that they had motive to want to please Jimmy Hoffa. Three,
and they had their own motive to want
to get back in Cuba and all that, to
organize crime. John Kennedy so that Robert Kennedy would be out of power.
And the third thing is that there was this toast after the assassination of the president suggesting that now they could get on with business as it used to be.
And there were subsequent conversations in December of 1963 where Marcello said to Regano, Jimmy owes me big now, and another separate conversation the week after where Hoffa says to Regano, I owe a lot to Carlos. And in fact, in the 70s, after Hoffa gets out of prison, he goes back to Regano and asks him to go back to the same two guys, Marcello and Trafficante, and ask them to murder Fitzsimmons, who replaced Hoffa as president of the Teamsters.
Couple of quick questions. Where is Marcello and Trafficante both dead now, or either of them alive?
No, Trafficante died in 1987. Marcello is alive and living in New Orleans and suffering from Alzheimer's disease and probably can't remember anything about his own life.
Is this the way we're going to begin to know more? Is that somebody's going to step forward and somebody else is going to be able to add to the story, and then you think, because most people some people I know believe in a single assassin theory, primarily because this kind of thing, the story hasn't unraveled in a major way with someone that they thought, had credibility, other than some, one conspiracy theory after another.
Regard this as final, decisive legal proof that these three guys did it, but I think Regano is a legendary lawyer who was a direct participant in a series of conversations which he believes convinced him that two of his own clients conspired to murder the president.
Jack, I thank you for joining me for this to catch on this story. Jack Newfield speaking to us by phone about an exclusive story based on some conversations he had with Jimmy Hoffa's lawyer. That is the subject of JFK, Hoffa, and the Mob, a Frontline documentary which will air tomorrow at 9 on PBS. Frontline correspondent and New York Post columnist Jack Newfield joins me now to give us a preview of the incredible tale of mob lawyer Frank Regano, told in detail for the first time in that Frontline broadcast, and we're pleased to have Jack back here. Welcome.
Always a pleasure.
I just said, I remember when this story first appeared, you were on the phone, we were doing a phone hookup. Let me just set the stage for this. You are not some conspiracy buff with respect to John F. Kennedy.
I have sort of have an aversion to assassinations, because I was about 10 feet away when Robert was assassinated.
And we're close friends with
Robert.
And wrote a book, in fact,
yes.
about him. So how come you come to this in what? How did you come to this story?
My dear friend Nick Pileggi, who has known Frank Regano since 1967,
and known as to know about as much about organized crime as you can be if you're not in law enforcement, maybe more.
I call him the Boswell of the gangsters.
Exactly.
He called me up in September of '91, and he wanted me to read a manuscript Regano had written, which was very primitive and not publishable. But buried in the manuscript on page 445 was these series of anecdotes about conversations that he, Regano, had with Santo Trafficante, who was his client for 30 years, and Jimmy Hoffa, who was his client for 15 years.
And Santo Trafficante was who?
The mob boss of Florida, who had run the casinos in Cuba before Castro's revolution, and was probably the most intelligent and bloodthirsty gangster of all time. His father was a Don. Right. He's a mob prince who was raised to run a mob family. And Marcelo was the mob boss of New Orleans, and Trafficante's cohort in many ventures. They were together in Havana running casinos. They shared the same lawyers sometimes. They shared friendships with Jimmy Hoffa.
And what's the headline, and what's, in a sense, the first paragraph of what Regano tells you in Frontline that is so explosive?
He describes a deathbed conversation he had with Trafficante 4 days before Trafficante died, where Trafficante calls him up and is reviewing his life and saying, I shouldn't have gotten married, I regret knowing the families of people I had to have murdered. And in the course of this rambling reminiscence, he says, quote, Carlos screwed up, we should have killed Bobby instead of Jack, unquote. And Regano takes that to be a confession.
Yeah. And there is also, as a context for this, the fact that Hoffa had told Regano
Marcelo and Trafficante to assassinate President Kennedy.
Do you believe that Regano is telling the truth?
I believe he is telling the truth about the 5 or 6 specific conversations he testifies to.
You can't testify as to whether Trafficante was lying to Regano.
Right,
or others.
And I think it doesn't prove how these guys did it operationally or methodologically. But I believe that these conversations occurred, and I think they add to our historical knowledge of the assassination for the first time in a long time.
And advances the notion in your judgment that organized crime had something to do with the murder of John F. Kennedy.
Which was the tentative conclusion of the House Assassination Committee report of '79. And in fact, when we interview Robert Blakey at the Notre Dame Law School, who wrote the House Assassination report, we say, what do you think about Regano's revelations? And he says, they are not revelations. They are confirmations of what we believed 15 years ago.
The committee believed that.
Right. What the committee said that Trafficante, Marcello, and Hoffa had, quote, means, motive, and opportunity to assassinate President Kennedy.
This is a clip from Frontline on PBS tomorrow night. Here is Frank Regano. What's his first name?
Frank Regano.
Frank Regano, the lawyer.
But the most startling revelation in this deathbed conversation concerned the assassination of President Kennedy and the involvement of Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss.
And he said that Carlos had fucked up, when he got rid of Giovanni. He called John Kennedy Giovanni in Italian as John, as I knew he was referring to. And then he said that they should have gotten rid of Bobby instead.
Well, when he says Carlos fucked up, what does that mean?
That they should have killed Bobby instead of John Kennedy. That's a clear message to me. It's very clear to me.
Why does he think he should have killed Bobby instead of John Kennedy?
Well, I think the motive for assassinating President Kennedy was to remove Robert as Attorney General. Who was,
kill the head or the body will go.
Well, that's what Carlos Marcello said to this guy, Ed Becker, who is still alive and we interviewed on the program. But the motive was to get rid of Bobby, who had started this incredible war on organized crime. Prosecutions of organized crime figures went up 700% in 3 years and would decline 75%.
And the fact is that organized crime thought that President Kennedy's administration would be kinder to them because there was some relationship,
there was an element of
money that went into the campaign.
The mob always hedges its bets.
Right,
like in
both
Cuba,
sides.
the Trafficante supported Castro and was bribing Batista. In the 1960 election, elements of the mob, Marcello and Hoffa, supported Nixon. Giancana and Roselli supported Kennedy, and Roselli was friends with Kennedy's father.
Now, Johnny Roselli ended up in a barrel off the coast of Miami. What did he do to get there? What was it that he had said beforehand?
He began to gossip about the murder of John Kennedy to Jack Anderson, the columnist.
Saying?
The mob did it, basically. Also, he had testified in front of the Church Committee about the mob CIA plots to assassinate Castro. And Trafficante was very nervous about that. When the Church Committee was formed, the next day, Trafficante went to Costa Rica for a year to avoid testifying. And most people think Trafficante had his two partners in the CIA mafia plots, Giancana and Roselli, murdered.
If you, in fact, tend to disbelieve a conspiracy theory of the assassination of President Kennedy and accept the Warren Commission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what is the most persuasive evidence that you have seen that would change your mind? Is it simply Frank Regano saying, and Frank Regano's wife as well, saying?
I think the assassination of President Kennedy is this jigsaw puzzle we've been looking at for 29 years this week.
Right.
And I think we will never have all the pieces. There will never be a trial. There will never be a confession. There will never be new forensic evidence. I think what Regano adds is a few new pieces to the puzzle. There are still many pieces missing. But if you look at a puzzle that's almost finished, you can begin to make out the faces in the puzzle, and I think you can make out the faces of Giancana, of Trafficante, and Marcello, and possibly others.
Yeah, but possibly others includes Jimmy Hoffa. Now, there's some who say they buy the organized crime, but they don't buy Jimmy Hoffa.
I don't really buy Hoffa myself. I think Hoffa was an instigator, a kibitzer. But Hoffa was subordinate to Marcello and Trafficante. He could not order them around. He sent messages through Regano to kill Robert, to kill Robert and then to kill Jack.
A lot of stories come out of this. Number one, it is that Jim Garrison, who just died recently, that Jim Garrison always said it was the CIA, and that's part of the point of view of JFK, Oliver Stone's film. You point out here that some say that Garrison said that to take the heat off the mob because the mob was supporting him in his desire to be governor of Louisiana.
Regano tells us on camera that Marcello told him that he had influence over Garrison, and Professor Blakey says the same thing.
And Carlos Marcello also said that if he was going to have this done at some point, he told somebody he'd have a crazy person done.
He said it to Ed Becker.
To Ed Becker, who was a former what?
Las Vegas promoter, who was still around.
One other point. Jack Ruby and Oswald were known to Carlos Marcello and had some kind of, and Ruby, in fact, knew the mob from Cuba?
Ruby had Teamster connections. Ruby helped get Trafficante out of Cuba when Castro detained him. We show Ruby's tourist card entering Cuba on August 8th, 59, and visiting Trafficante in prison. Oswald's uncle, who was like a surrogate father, Dutz Moritz, worked for Marcello. Ruby obtained strippers for his Dallas nightclubs from Marcello's operation in New Orleans.
A couple last 2 points. Number one, people say this guy's just trying to sell a book or something like that. Regano.
He is trying to sell a book.
And that he's just looking for some story that'll sell books, and therefore you can't believe it.
That is a factor to consider, and we considered it, and we approached the whole project with a fair degree of skepticism, and we confronted him on various points.
Pileggi believes this too?
Pileggi believes it, vouches for him, Professor Blakey vouches for him. I don't believe somebody would, just to sell a book, would put themselves in a position to be harmed by the mob. And the fact that in his own manuscript, all this assassination stuff was started on page 445, shows he didn't have any great commercial sense of what he knew.
Yeah, right. He didn't blare it out there.
And
it
the
was
fact,
buried.
and his wife is so believable on the show.
Right.
And they both had dinner with Trafficante the night of the assassination.
And he celebrated the assassination.
Right. And she ran out of the restaurant. And he's toasting Robert Kennedy's end of power.
If you want to see the complete story, it's on Frontline with an interview and reporting by Jack Newfield. Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Good to have you.